So great to see so many people here at the Stimson Center for what's going to be a terrific conversation with our amazing experts on the issues of climate change and our military readiness and competition and many other issues which we're going to discuss today. And welcome to those of you who are online. I think we have a number of people virtually watching, so thank you everyone for showing up on a Thursday morning. I had to tell you, my traffic was very tough this morning, so I'm really grateful. So anyways, I'm Sally Ozell. I'm the director of the Environmental Security Program here at the Stimson Center. And this is just a really timely conversation for many reasons. I mean, let's just start with this coming Monday, which kicks off Climate Week in New York once again. And once again, as we start Climate Week, we have continued to break more and more records, climate records, and new extremes that we've seen this past year. And these extremes are really challenging our military readiness at home and abroad and affecting global security. So today we're going to hear from these two amazing experts with both of them very storied careers in both policy making and leadership in our military, who will discuss, again, as I said, how climate change is affecting U.S. security and how our military is responding to this threat. So with us today, right to my immediate left, is Sherry Goodman, who is the Secretary General of the International Military Council and a senior fellow at the Wilson Center. Now, Sherry and I have been friends and colleagues for a very long time. We both started our careers on Capitol Hill when she worked for Chairman Sam Nunn, who chaired the Senate Armed Services Committee, when I worked for John Kerry as his environmental staff person. And I must be very honest, over the years, I have benefited so greatly from Sherry's vast expertise, really connecting the environmental security issues with military readiness. And on the Hill, Sherry really started what has been this amazing, lifelong quest to educate a generation of members of Congress, of the brass at the Pentagon, and others in our U.S. military to really understand the critical links between the environment, energy, climate change, and our national security. And I'll have to say, just a little quick plug, through Island Press, Sherry has just come out with a new book called Threat Multiplier, and it really chronicles these issues and lays out a very compelling story of why clean energy and the environment and climate is so important to our global security and strategic, operational, and tactical implications. So thank you, Sherry, and there are flyers out front for folks if you want to purchase a book. You can get a little code and it gives you a discount. And then we're so lucky to have Admiral John Richardson, who is a retired four-star admiral with a very illustrious career. And several years ago, I was lucky enough to be invited by the Admiral to speak on a panel during the International Sea Power Symposium, when he serves as the Chief of Naval Operations. So I remember walking into this lobby and being so overwhelmed by the scores of admirals and brass from navies from all over the world, from Europe theater, the Pacific, East and West Africa, Central and South America, each with a different uniform, all speaking a different language. I was like, oh my. But what really impressed me most was that the CNO invited me to speak and understood the importance of the environment to the world's navies and the security implications. And that was really amazing. And so prior to becoming CNO, Admiral Richardson was also the director of nuclear propulsion. He also served on nuclear subs. I think, how many years did you say you were undersea?
12-ish years.
12-ish. A long time. Needless to say, he has had this front row seat on how climate change has and is affecting our military operations, either on land or undersea, and how it affects the readiness every day. And so whether it's tactical or operational in the face of the climate emergency and the cascading implications, he has really led the Navy by securing military bases, fleets, naval assets, supported Navy personnel, local communities, and really helped partner and build resilience in many of the island states, and just increase preparedness for by offering humanitarian assistance and in the face of extremes. So as Secretary Christine Wormuth told us just recently, she was here last week, I guess, yeah, she noted that the record-breaking heat of this past summer has really impacted our military readiness and our troops, not our readiness, really impacted our troops and the training facilities, many of which are located, as you know, in some of the hottest parts of our country. And some of the other issues, before we jump into the discussion, just to frame a bit. Over the past 2 years, the U.S. military deployed more than 70 times domestically in response to climate-related hazards. And think about this, the amount of time the National Guard has spent fighting wildfires has increased from about 14,000 personnel days in 2016 to 176,000 personnel days. 14,000, 176,000 in 2021. And, you know, the bases are being affected. Last year, for example, Typhoon Mawar struck Andersen Air Force Base in Guam. And reconstruction costs are estimated to be about $4 billion. So in addition to these effects on U.S. military facilities and operations, climate change is really also reshaping some of our strategic global landscape. Tropical cyclones are hitting Southeast Asia at Category 5 levels. And that includes the Philippines, for example, in greater frequency and intensity. And that's, you know, as we all know, that is an area that is growing great power competition with China. And then we've been seeing rising sea levels, compounding by coastal erosion. In Bangladesh, it's permanently inundated 17% of Bangladesh. And this is one of the most populated, dense countries in the world. And lastly, or almost lastly, changes in ocean temperatures is causing fish to migrate away from artisanal fishers and out of reach of their ability. And in Africa in particular, this is causing food and economic insecurity, and it's stressing developing coastal communities, which is also compounded by IUU fishing. Small island states is another example. Kiribati, Palau, the Marshall Islands, all critical to our naval operations, literally disappearing beneath the waves. And for us here at Stimson, we have witnessed these cascading climate risks and vulnerabilities firsthand through our Corvi program, which has conducted 16 climate risk assessments in small island and coastal developing states. And finally, where there are no people currently, looking at the Arctic. As ice continues to melt in the Arctic, new sea lanes are emerging, offering access to minerals and fisheries, and really the potential for new competition. So I've kind of set a daunting stage here, and what we clearly have a lot to unpack with Sherry and Admiral Richardson. So let me begin, Sherry, with a question for you, if I could. Okay. So your new book, Threat Multiplier, in it you note that over the past several decades, the U.S. military has moved from, and I'm going to quote you, an environmental laggard to a climate leader. And in 2021, Secretary Austin said that climate change is a national security issue. So here's the question. As a longtime leader in pushing the U.S. military to address environmental and climate threats, what has this evolution looked like from the inside? Why was it so important? And what lessons does it hold for our future?
Well, thank you very much, Sally. Brief on the book. I mean, I think you guys could just all buy it right now. We can go home and read it and all good. Okay. So thank you, Sally. Thank you, Admiral. Thank all of you for being here today. Really, it's a pleasure to be back here at Stimson. Such a great organization. Very fond of it. And as Sally said, you know, we both started out in the same era in the 1980s in the Senate. So let me take you back to that era because closed and is no more, and that's a symbol of sort of the changing tides, if you will. Both we had enough plutonium. We had a Secretary of Energy who said we were awash in plutonium at that time, a Republican secretary, and then environment, safety, and health requirements began to apply to federal facilities. And I say my own career went from weapons to waste. Okay, fast forward into the 1990s at the Department of Defense, and that I really call the first chapter of environmental security. Sally, you run the environmental security program now here. That was a new term at the time. And, you know, reflecting on what I think are really the three major lines of effort we had in that era, we were cleaning up a lot of military bases. We were also complying with natural resource laws from endangered species, which had shut down training at an Army base in North Carolina to protect the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker. The Navy was dealing with marine mammal issues, and there were many, many such issues. So there was cleanup, natural resources, and then I really say the third major line of effort was mill-to-mill environmental cooperation in the wake of the Cold War, working to remove nuclear materials from the former Soviet states, and also building environmental trust and cooperation with allies and partners. Those first two, cleanup and natural resources and other things in that era, really were driven by legal requirements. Okay, we had the first era of enforcing environmental laws on federal facilities, including the Department of Defense. Now, that produced really a culture change in the department, where it had been initially sort of resistant to this. It said, you know, it impairs military readiness, we can't do this, blah, blah, blah. You know, but when it either shut down training or people were fined, and there were some even criminal fines in that era on the Clean Water Act, that really woke people up. They were like, oh yeah, okay, I got to take care of that. That drove programming, planning, and budgeting in the Department of Defense. But at the same time, as it was seen as an external legal requirement, it began to institutionalize within the department. Slowly but surely, members of the military and the leadership began to realize, okay, there are actually benefits if we figure out how we can actually manage training on these military bases and not cut down the tree for the red-cockaded woodpecker. We can actually use it as a realistic training obstacle. So we don't have to have a trade-off. We can actually make these things work together. So then fast forward to the climate era, which I say really started in the aughts with when I convened the first group of generals and admirals to assess the national security implications of climate change. Some of Admiral Richardson's predecessors, PACOM Commander Admiral Pryor, General Gordon Sullivan, Army Chief of Staff, was our first chairman, General Zinni, Admiral Skip Bowman, head of the nuclear Navy. And we spent a year learning from the world's leading climate scientists and assessed that climate change would be a threat multiplier. That's where I coined that term in 2007 when we wrote our first report. It's the title of the book. And really that marked the movement into what I call the second chapter of climate security, where it now is
she really did move the needle within the Pentagon on these issues. And so for those of you, particularly young folks today, you have no idea what it was like then versus today. And so we're really grateful.
Thank you.
You've been amazing. Admiral Richardson, so you also, I mean, you've you were in charge of the whole Navy, the whole U.S. Navy as the Chief of Naval Operations. And, when it comes to climate change and the military, then and now, what really kept you up at night or keeps you up at night?
Yeah. Well, first, Sally, let me just thank you for having me here today. And it's always fantastic to work with Stimson and work with yourself, just as we did back at the International Sea Power Symposium. Sherry, always fantastic to collaborate with you. We're doing collaborations on so many other areas. And I got to confess that if there's ever felt like a third wheel, right, now I feel like that third wheel, right? I mean, two powerhouses in climate awareness and the growing awareness of that, how we must really respond to that, but also super good friends. And so I'll do my best to just sort of hang on. I also have to just put my, add my voice to just the book, Threat Multiplier. I mean, it is such a terrific book. It is densely packed, but has the virtue of being very, very readable. And can I just borrow it real quick? Mm-hmm. It's like perfect sized, It's not one of these monstrous tomes that is going to like break your rib if you try and read it in a chair or in bed. But neither is it, a pamphlet. It's just, I think, the perfect size. So I highly recommend it. And it's perfectly titled because, that was sort of the thing, to get back to your question, Sally, is what kind of keeps operational and even, man, train, and equip type people awake right now with respect to climate is that it is a threat multiplier. And just sort of, you zoom in and we've talked about the weather, really, storms and such. And, the Navy has just so much history of how things can go badly if you don't pay attention to things and you ignore things like the weather, right? I mean, it's just a very, very violent thing. It can result in a loss of personnel and ships and those sorts of things. While I was CNO, we had that period of time where there was it seemed like the 100-year storm was hitting us every year, right? Particularly down at the hurricanes in the southeast, and we had to learn very fast how to just operate the fleet to sortie the fleet out of the path of the storm when they were in port, and those ships that couldn't get underway, how to secure them better. We got pretty good at it, right? So there is some benefits, and there's learning possibilities if you sort of pay attention. And so I just want to thank you both for kind of bringing this to our attention, right, and waking us up to this. I think you can really talk about strategic, operational, and tactical level concerns when you talk about the climate. Strategically, in terms of just global security, we're honored to have Mr. Keating in the audience, who's done so much time in Somalia. And, that's a terrific example of just sort of, where strategic concerns come together. When, by virtue of climate change, a particular ocean current or an ocean temperature might, change just enough so that, let's say, the fish, migrate further off the coast of some of these nations that are, challenged to get out to sea in the first place and be aware of things. Now their entire food stuff, their source of food has disappeared. Two dimensions to that. One, it has gone from those people who relied on it so much. And, when a state cannot guarantee kind of some of the basic needs of its people, the ability of that state to really control things starts to erode. It gets very granular, very fast, down at almost a neighborhood level. And, the strongest sometimes just move to the leadership positions, which is, often not what we want. And, Somalia is a terrific example. So not only do you deny that food to those who need it, but that food moves into a deeper part of the ocean, let's say in this case, and that plays right into the hands of people who are doing all of this illegal and unreported fishing, IUU fishing, which is why we highlighted at that time at the International Sea Power Symposium, because so many chiefs of Navy around the world that's one of their top missions, is just to kind of understand their exclusive economic zone, where are the fish moving, and secure them for their own people rather than, those nations, China and others, who can come in with big global fleets and really kind of devastate the entire population. So that, and that's just one example of kind of a strategic challenge. Operationally, you mentioned the Arctic, and I think that we're not only the strategic challenge of the Arctic we could talk about, but operationally, there are just sea lanes and transit lanes that are open now that were not open before, right? I mean, that's just a fact on the ground. And so it's really just a matter of time before those become much more used and become the routine. You save an awful lot of mileage and money from a commercial standpoint if you can use that path over Eurasia. Strategically, from a security standpoint, that means you don't have to go through a lot of the choke points and straits that you currently do, which play into the military and geostrategic thinking. And so that's just an operational matter that we've got to contend with. We've got to prepare our ships to be able to operate up there. It's still a very difficult environment. We could talk a lot about that. It's still very, very cold. And communication and satellite coverage and all those sorts of things are very challenging up there. And then down to just the tactical matters of how do I secure our bases? How do we think along with the communities in which we reside to do those sorts of things? So I think that there's no shortage of projections of the climate on national security. It really runs the gamut. And I think every branch of the military is affected by this, some in different ways. The land forces, Army, Marine Corps are going to be very concerned about rising temperatures and storms and those sorts of things. At sea, we're seeing ocean currents start to move or slow down. These monstrous ocean currents act like just gigantic heat engines that affect global temperatures. And so, and then, all of the storms and everything else. So, yeah, no shortage of things to pay attention to. And again, thanks for bringing this all to our national attention.
So yeah, food security in coastal developing states, Arctic issues with the lanes opening and more competition, readiness. So let's sort of share. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this sort of great power competition. I mean, you in your book you talk about different geographies around the world, up in the Arctic as well as in the Indo-Pacific. So, I mean, just even thinking about the Indo-Pacific for a minute, they're the most vulnerable to climate change, especially in the low-lying, both U.S. territories, but then also in foreign island states like Guam or Palau or Marshall Islands. Well, Guam is not foreign, but so the Biden administration, I mean, they've hosted the Pacific Island Forum twice during recently, and during which climate change and readiness was really, really front and center. So why is that so important that a president would bring them here twice or meet with them twice and really raise this issue? Why is it important to the United States and our readiness?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I think in recent years we have reawakened to the strategic importance of small Pacific Island nations to the U.S. Of course, we knew that during World War II, that was critical to our victory in the Pacific. But then during the Cold War, they seemed perhaps less important to strategic competition. But now in an era where China is seeking global influence on a variety of levels, not only military but economic and diplomatic, it is offering the features of its Belt and Road Initiative even into the small island states that are highly vulnerable to climate risks. Some, like Tuvalu and Kiribati, will lose parts of their atolls in coming decades and are already seeking ways to move their populations either to Fiji. Kiribati has a plan to move to Fiji, and Tuvalu to Australia, I believe. So these countries are highly at risk, and so they also find attractive investments that are made that also then send them into a debt trap, as we've seen at other Chinese investments around the world. But it's not a choice for them whether it's the U.S. or China. They want both, and we have to realize that around the world today, that many of our allies and partners, they don't want to, they want to have what they can get that serves their own interests. And so we have to present attractive foreign policy, diplomatic, and national security strategies that both meet our own needs, but recognize the needs, particularly of the Pacific Island states. And as you said, Sally, they are existentially at risk. They also have large, they may be small island states, but they have large exclusive economic zones, which are now being encroached upon by particularly illegal fishing, large fishing fleets, also pollution, plastic waste. And so they have a variety of threats that they face. And that's why the integration that we've seen and the alignment, I think, in the last few years of both small Pacific Island nations, and some of this is also true in the Caribbean, with our overall national security strategy is highly important. The Secretary of the Navy talks about this a lot, Carlos Del Toro, providing climate dashboards, for example, by the Navy to some of the small Pacific Island and Caribbean nations so that they have better climate intelligence. This is partly the front line of where we are in terms of how do we better understand our climate future. Because as the Admiral said, weather is so important. Weather is important to everything we do, right? You look at your weather app, how many times a day I'm looking at my weather app? What's it going to be like? Is it going to rain, right? And weather is reliable out for about 7 days today. When I was young, it was only 3 or 4 days. Okay, so we're improving our skill and our prediction in weather. But then think about climate, okay? We start out with large global climate models that tell us 50 to 100 years, sea level is going to rise X amount, okay? That's good for global climate assessment out for a long term. But you've got to close the gap between big global climate models. So think of the geographic scale and the time scale. So weather short and small and accurate on a small geographic scale. Climate now, big geography, broad, longer time scale. So closing that gap, what the military calls closing the 1 to 10 year gap in climate prediction, is highly important. And it's really not only the military and every sector of society, think insurance, banking, real estate, transportation, agriculture. We all need this improved climate intelligence. So, we need to own the weather, own our future weather in the way that, we talked about in the 90s, owning the night with night vision goggles. So this improved predictive capability or climate intelligence is going to be increasingly important. And that's when we come back to any particular region, whether it's the small Pacific Island nations, helping them know, and then also having more targeted visibility. As the Admiral said, we don't have good satellite coverage, or we don't have good AIS coverage, so we don't know where the illegal fishers are, or we don't know in the Arctic exactly the extent of sea ice retreat. I had the privilege of being in Greenland this summer, really where you can see the climate future. You can see that Greenland ice sheet melting. You can hear it in the calving of the ice. It's really astounding. It's astoundingly beautiful, but it's astoundingly, you just know that you're seeing the future accelerate. And when you travel in Greenland, mostly you're traveling by ship along the coast because the center of it is mostly a large ice sheet. And increasingly, with the melting of the major fjords, you have a lot more ice in the coastal waters. And so I'm talking to this ship captain, this female ship captain one day, and she's navigating us through these, through these icebergs as we're traveling. And I said, how do you know, where do you have she's looking at this map. She said, yeah, I get this NASA feed, and it's telling me, but it only comes twice a day. So it may not be accurate as to where I'm, what's really in front of me is not necessarily what the satellite picture is giving, the map on my ship at any given moment. So that was just a very visible example of how we don't have real-time data. And as the Admiral said, we're going to have much more ship traffic, sea surface traffic in the Arctic. Putin has a goal to convert the northern sea route along the Russian coastline into a toll road for transportation from ports in Asia to ports in Europe. and this summer already allowed a non-ice-clad vessel to transit the Arctic. Now, there was not a mishap, but when you talk about what keeps you up at night in the Arctic, it's really about that oil spill waiting to happen in the Arctic. And, that will make the cleanup of the Exxon Valdez or Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf look easy compared to a transboundary Arctic oil spill.
Wow, well, that's so true. I mean, we don't have assets there today to clean up an oil spill, and we lived through those oil spills, so we know how devastating that can be.
It's not just assets, Sally, right? I mean, it is still very difficult to operate up there. It's warmer, but it's still really cold, and just operating, and it'll be a seasonal thing, right? I mean, it'll be passable during some parts of the year, but trying to clean up something in the in the autumn as it's getting colder and colder, it's just the levels of difficulty there are crazy. Sure, I'm glad you mentioned insurance, because that's another sort of leading indicator of where the threats are emerging. And you can see that the insurance industry is driving shipping right now in response to the Houthi rebels and all their activity in the Red Sea. Hey, we're going around now, right? Most of those ships are going around because you can't get insurance to go through. And similarly, we've seen, particularly if you're trying to buy property in parts of California, good luck finding somebody who's going to insure that at any type of level that's affordable. So I think that, the other thing, I see my good friend Phil Cullum here, he's even more scientific geek than me. And, I'm a kind of a science fiction fan. So when you talk about these Pacific Island nations, one of the classic science fiction plot lines is that for one reason or another, Earth is going to become uninhabitable, and we have to go out into space and find another place for humanity to thrive, right? Interstellar is one of my favorite movies in that regard. But that's kind of the mindset that some of these leaders of these nations are dealing with, right? They are losing their nation because of these sea rises. It's just, as you said in your introduction, it's going underwater. So how do I get my people to another place where it's safe and they can thrive? What an amazing challenge for a national leader. So it brings it all home, with a great intensity, if you think about it that way.
Let me follow up on that for a minute. I mean, you had said earlier about shipping routes, increasing in the Arctic. So do you think with the insurance and the issues that are going on, like the Straits of Hormuz or Malacca or some of the other places, are not going to be the mainstay in the future?
I think it'll all be a matter of containing that risk and understanding that risk. And the good thing about the insurance industry is they have some of the best mathematicians in the world, who can characterize risk. And so when that equation comes out that, hey, there's sufficiently clear passage up there, these ice flows that you talked about, there's few enough of them that you can get from point A to point B with an acceptable degree of risk, that's going to be the time that it switches. And like we said, it'll switch for part of the year. It'll probably close down for other parts of the year, but it'll provide just opportunities and challenges, depending upon which side of that equation you're on, going forward. And I had to laugh when I was driving ships around as the Navy. He always did sort of, like, okay, I get it that you can look at your display, but just look out the window, will you please? Yeah. It's great that you got the NASA download from 8 hours ago, but the thing is right in front of you. Look out the window.
So okay, this is a lot of issues, and clearly our leadership in the military and our leadership at the White House and the State Department and others really have to work together. So this is sort of a question for both of you, but let me start with you, Admiral. I mean, you served under two very different administrations. These issues have been the same. They haven't gone away or changed from one administration to the next. They are issues that we face, this existential threat of climate change and how it affects our security. So how have policies and operations, does it change from one administration to the other in how, say, just the Navy or or defense writ large approaches these issues. And, it would be remiss for me not to ask with an election coming up, not that you have to reflect on that specifically, but just in general, I mean, does it change from administration to administration in the way operations take?
I would have to say, Sally, that, and I'm going to be mindful to stay apolitical, just as I was in uniform and have tried to continue. I'm a big fan of Cincinnatus and General Marshall, and so I'll just stay in the center of the channel there, and say that, hey, really, at the operational level, at the strategic, operational, and tactical level, in terms of operating forces, it really doesn't matter who's in charge, because these things are manifesting themselves with increasing urgency and frequency. And so you said that, you mentioned that things haven't changed. I think in many ways there has been a change. There's increasing awareness, but I think that awareness is a result of even the most reluctant adopters can't deny what they see. Right now, I'll leave it to Sherry to answer the second part of the question in terms of the discussion about causality and all of those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, these storms are here, right? We just have to deal. There's opportunities for, increased opportunities for humanitarian assistance as other nations who are, much fewer resources than we have are dealing with these storms as they hit their nations with increasing temperature. They just need more and more assistance. And as you pointed out, that also is an area of competition, right? There's a soft power competition there that everybody's very aware of. And so we've got to have, I think, an optionality. We've got to provide options to these nations. I agree with you 100%, Sherry, that we shouldn't be forcing people to choose A or B. We should be sophisticated enough that we provide options for them to take. And so, to answer your question, kind of in terms of where do I send forces in response, that's pretty much dictated by what we actually see on the ground and at sea. Sherry's got the rest of the more interesting part of this answer.
Sherry, what do you think about that?
Well, I think the rhetoric is more polarized than the reality, particularly in the Defense Department and in military planning and operational circles. I mean, the reality is that the changing climate is accelerating even beyond what we've predicted. And as the Admiral and others and I've talked about, you have to be able to respond in any condition. You have to secure your forces, you have to protect your troops, you have to be able to operate forward under a changing climate, and you have to deal with the increasing threats that we face around the world from that. So that occurs, really regardless of administration. Sometimes the rhetoric is different. In the last administration, when climate was a four-letter word, I ran a series of projects with NOAA and the Department of Defense from the Wilson Center that we called Improving Predictive Capability for Disruptive Weather and Water Events. Now, improving predictive capability for disruptive weather and water events. Didn't say the word climate, okay? But, so there are what we call like, tactical workarounds, wordsmithing workarounds. And we operated as sort of a surrogate interagency activity because that was not as active, let's say, for example. But I would say within the department and within other federal agencies, a lot of the important work, let's say, to improve skill level in predictions at NOAA, or to develop the assessment tool that the Department of Defense now uses, the Defense Climate Assessment Tool, which started in the Army Corps of Engineers and now is a DoD-wide assessment tool for infrastructure. That work was done over multiple administrations and is now even being shared with our allies and partners. So, when we, need to be able to, protect our troops because now we have more black flag days where the wet bulb temperature is above 95 and it's more difficult to train in those conditions, that has to be done regardless of who, of the political cycle.
So, yeah, these issues aren't going away, and we need to, the military has already taken them on, as you've both,
Yeah,
talk
maybe
about.
I could make one other
Okay, go ahead.
observation. I
Yep.
would say that the defense authorization bill, the sort of the must-pass annual defense bill, contains actually some of the most bipartisan congressional action on climate change for the very fact that all members want to keep their bases in their district. And oh, by the way, most military bases today, they're not in New England and the blue states. They're in the red states in the South, right, and the Southwest. So I've had members of Congress tell me, you know, I don't think the red state members, you're not doing enough to, you know, protect Fort Hood against, you know, growing drought and erosion on the soil, and we need to ensure that our troops can train there. So that, you know, that has led to a focus on resilience for our infrastructure and our forces that is bipartisan.
You know, if I could also add on, I mean, I agree 100% with everything that you said, but in terms of the, you know, those tactical workarounds, as you said, where I'm going to find the right phraseology that'll allow me to do this work, yeah, you just do want to kind of get past that at some point, don't you? The waste of energy, it's like, what is going to be the acronym today? You know, that's the 6-month project, and you know, and of course, you know, and we just don't have that type of time or energy to waste anymore, right? In this or any other issue, there's just an increasing urgency, and you know, the one thing that will bring us all together and has in our history is some kind of a crisis. And I think that, you know, kind of the alarm bells are sounding louder and louder. Both sides of the aisle realize that this is kind of becoming, you know, sort of crisis proportions, that we've got to come together and solve this. You know, it is, as you pointed out, some of these things are slow moving. They're geologic over long time spans. But the reversibility of that sort of thing is, you know, once it gets a head of steam up, like the Atlantic current, right? I mean, that transfers more heat in the around the world than anything else by orders of magnitude, and really is the key. You mentioned Greenland, right? It's the key to sort of any kind of temperate temperatures in Scandinavia and those sorts of things. The evaporation that comes off of that current as it dives down, you know, multiple miles and becomes a deep cold current, and so. You know, if you're any one of the Scandinavian countries, you really want to make sure that that current, for a lot of reasons, doesn't weaken or get diverted or something. That, you know, it's just you got it's like the ship, right? A 2-degree course change at the start of the journey can have a lot more impact than a 2-degree course change at the end. At the end, if you've miscalculated, you're all back emergency, you know, left full rudder, it's a crisis, and you may not get there, right? So it's time to make these corrections now. Past time, bro.
So I'm being mindful of our time. I think we should see if folks in our audience or virtually have questions for you. So I'm going to turn to the group. And, oh boy, there are a lot of questions. Okay, so let's make our questions short. Just say who you are and answer short so we can get as many as possible. This gentleman on the aisle was the first hand up in the back. So let's start with you.
My name is Roger Cochetti, and I'm an editorial contributor on technology policy for the Hill newspaper. And I apologize for the fact that I have no knowledge of nuclear technology, but my question is for the Admiral and anyone else who wants to answer it. 70 years ago, the U.S. Navy, in conjunction with Westinghouse, figured out how to miniaturize a nuclear reactor and have people sleep within feet of that miniature nuclear reactor. And yet today, 70 years later, big thinkers like Bill Gates say, someday the solution is we can miniaturize nuclear reactors and make them safe. It may take decades and hundreds of billions of dollars, but miniaturized nuclear reactors is the key solution to climate change. But the Navy's been doing this for 70 years. I don't understand why you can't solve the climate problem today by just parking a nuclear submarine next to every city or whatever it takes, but you've been doing it for 70 years. So thank you.
Start, and then Sherry, I know that you can pick up, because this is another area where we collaborate a lot, is on clean energy, particularly nuclear energy, the contribution that nuclear can make to that. And you're right, what they're called small modular reactors right now. And in one perspective, the Navy has been building small modular reactors and putting them in aircraft carriers and submarines for some time. And but those are bespoke designs, right? We did hook up a submarine to Hawaii after Hurricane Iniki, but if you just go one level, of complexity below that, power is power, but power to put on the grid is conditioned in a particular way. It operates, with certain characteristics that are very, very important in terms of making it available safely on the grid. And a submarine, that power plant was designed to power up the submarine, and so it's not optimized to do that. Now, and there's plenty of things to keep the submarines busy, their day job, if you will. But I think your point is also a good one in that the nuclear industry, I think, is enjoying kind of a second renaissance, if you will, right now. And I would say that, again, you have to get kind of into the details. And so the technology that the Navy uses and most of the current nuclear fleet uses is one thing. But there are new nuclear technologies that I think open up tremendous opportunities for making nuclear power even more safe than it is today. It is the safest form of energy that we have. The current nuclear fleet is operating more effectively and safer than it ever has in its lifetime, right? And that's due to the diligence and skill and perseverance of a lot of people, from those setting the policies, doing the training, inspections, all the way down to those operators that are doing that day-to-day, 24/7. And so, but there are great technologies, and I think that there's an inherently governmental role to bring those technologies to maturity, to get whatever the technological sprints done, the regulatory part done, the licensing done, all so that we can bring more nuclear energy onto the grid in even safer way than it currently exists. Sherry, I'll offer you.
Sure. Well, the implication of your question is exactly right. It's not a technology issue. We can, for example, at the COP last year, many nations called for tripling nuclear energy worldwide. We need nuclear energy to address the climate problem. We won't have any hope of meeting, certainly not 1.5 and probably not even 2 degrees, unless we have nuclear energy, more of it, in the mix. And Admiral Richardson serves with me on a commission I co-chair with the former Deputy Secretary of Energy on nuclear energy and climate security. So, the essence of that is we have allowed in the United States a lapse in leadership in nuclear energy over the last several decades, to the point that we are dependent on Russian nuclear fuel to power even some of our own reactors. And China, meanwhile, is becoming a major exporter of nuclear technology, as is Russia. That puts us at peril for the safety concerns and loss of that important export market. But not only we need to be in this game, and there is safer technology today, it's a matter of really solving for the policy, financial capital, human capital, and permitting and licensing issues that are kind of all in this mix. But they are eminently solvable, and there are many who are working on this. I see Seth Gray, who heads Lightbridge Nuclear Fuel. There's advanced nuclear fuels, and advanced technology for small and micro reactors. The Department of Defense is planning to deploy a micro reactor at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. Bill Gates, of course, has his project in Wyoming. And there should be more, and hopefully will be more, on the books in the future. But this is important for American national security and our leadership in one of these key, we talk about how China has taken the beat on us on solar, in the solar market. We have to be mindful of the nuclear market as well.
I was going to just make that point, if I'll emphasize it, is that this is another area where we're not just here on our own, right? There is competition in this area, and there are dozens, I would say tens of reactors being built in China right now, some of them with these new technologies. And so there's more than just the economic and technological part of this, right? Sort of we need a seat at the table to make sure that we've got a voice in the regulatory scheme, the safety scheme, because this is going to become a global matter, a much more global matter very quickly. And just as you said, you export a nuclear power plant, that's a 40 to 80 year relationship that you have with that country. And we want to have those relationships rather than some of our competitors.
Right. I mean, the good news is we are increasing over, the prior low baseline through Exim Bank and Development Finance Corporation and others, so that we have new projects going underway in Poland and Romania and some other places. But we should be, and there is actually a whole program at the State Department called FIRST, Foundational Infrastructure for Small Reactor Technology, that's developing in Africa, so to enable us to provide the safety, nuclear safety expertise and requirements, as well as the infrastructure and training.
Wow, so daunting, but so hopeful at the other hand, such an opportunity. Okay, gentlemen in the front row, you were sort of waving at me, so.
Sorry, yeah. Jérôme Leblanc from the European Parliament Liaison Office to the US Congress. Thank you very much. Two small questions. One elephant in the room, and I'm not talking politics here in the US, but is migration, and certainly it seems quite evident that there is a link between climate change and migrations all over the world. This is a very challenging issue, not only in the US, but in Europe also. So, I mean, is this something you're talking about in your book, and why isn't it been talked more about, I mean, as, solving two problems which are so interlinked? And the second question is about...
Let's go with one question on migration, if we could, because that's a big question.
I think we sort of touched on it very briefly. This is one of those things that's going to drive and amplify security challenges, right? So we've talked about it for a number of reasons, whether you're losing your national territory by virtue of sea level rise, or you're losing your food or water by virtue of climate changes. Hey, the people that used to rely on those, that live on that land that's now underwater, the people that used to eat that food that's now gone, people that used to drink that water that's evaporated, they're going to have to go somewhere else. And so, of course, that drives migration. The two are linked.
Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with that. From, Africa to Latin America, we see growing food and water insecurity, weaponization of food and water by terrorists or malign actors against vulnerable populations who are, who have less ample resources, driving migration. It should be, but migration's also historically been a strategy of resilience over millennia. So we expect people to migrate, but we have to have the right tools. We don't have them in the United States today, where it is very polarized. But it's a growing challenge, and one that's particularly that affects children worldwide.
Do I have time for one more question? Yes. Okay. Max, if we could. And let me just say that they have graciously agreed to stick around for a few minutes, and so we'll continue and be able to answer questions and have this conversation.
Opportunity to buy.
Yes.
Hi there, Max Valentine from Oceana. My question is, what role do you think the U.S. defense institution should be playing in mitigating climate-exacerbated risks posed by illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, particularly in regions where food and economic insecurity are heightened?
Yeah, why don't we start with Admiral, because you've raised that with me, and we talked about it years ago.
Yeah, I think if to really answer that question, all you have to do is talk to many of the chiefs of Navy of those nations, coastal nations, and particularly kind of in the tropics, and they would look for assistance in. Yeah, I mean, they'll take everything that they can get, right? Because they're really starting with a very bare bones type of capability. Some have a difficult time being aware of what is happening in their territorial seas, never mind their exclusive economic zones, which is a much bigger, body of water. And so in terms of just what can we contribute, right? How can we help? Well, there's maritime domain awareness tools, right, that we can bring. So sensors, processing centers, developing the tactical picture, so that at least allows them to know what's going on in their territorial waters and their exclusive economic zones. Then, if we can, and they can afford to not only acquire but also maintain and operate, then there's those kind of response forces that can go out and respond to what they see. And so, I think that's really kind of that's kind of what we do, right? I mean, the defense industry and the services, we're increasingly capable in terms of being able to find and fix things, whether it's through overhead sensors or whatever it might be. But I think also there's a growing commercial capability in this area, right? And so it doesn't necessarily, it may not even be optimally procured or provided through military channels, which are complicated. You can just go and buy it, right, from an increasingly commercial space and maritime company that would be happy to provide that service, possibly at a much more effective and affordable cost.
Add anything?
Only that, and excellent answer, Admiral, that even though the military is not on the front lines of that mission set, I mean, in the U.S. it's really the Coast Guard, but there are a lot of things that the Department of Defense can do either in coordination with the Coast Guard or the commercial sector, and by elevating attention to it in public forums, as has been done since John Kerry was Secretary of State and started the Oceans Conferences and made this front and center, and then brought more organizations, both in the U.S. and worldwide, together to highlight attention to it and the importance of addressing it on many fronts.
Yeah, and I'll just add the Obengama Games are a perfect example of training folks to be able to, that the Navy sort of heads up with other navies. I think, I hate to say this, time has just flown by, and I think we don't have any more time for any more questions, but again, I urge everyone, Admiral and Sherry have graciously said they're happy to stick around.
Particularly if you buy the book.
And talk with all of you. And Sherry will sign the book. I just finished the book. It's terrific. So kudos to Island Press and Sherry for getting this finished. It was a big force. And Admiral, like always, thank you for being so insightful on many of these issues and taking the time to come on down. So have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.